Every day, 5 times a day, more than 1 billion Muslims pray to Allah, the holy and omnipotent creator of the world. These prayers, called Salah, were prescribed by the Prophet Muhammad and hold a central place in the spiritual life of believers. Muslims direct their prayer words toward the sacred stone relic located in the heart of the holy city of Mecca, immersing themselves in deep reflection on their faith, the essence of Islam, and their spiritual duties. Each day, they gather together in prayer, creating a sense of unity and solidarity, demonstrating their belonging to one religion and one spiritual cause. In their consciousness, Prophet Muhammad is regarded as a great messenger, the Quran as a sacred scripture filled with divine revelations, and Mecca as a holy city, the center of their spiritual life and pilgrimage. However, in light of recent archaeological research, new discoveries, and attempts to understand the origins of this ancient culture, scholars have begun to ask questions that reveal new facets of Islamic history. They closely analyze and challenge many previously widespread beliefs to understand how potential changes in perception might influence established convictions and traditions. In the modern world, humanity has gained a unique advantage: access to new technologies that significantly broaden our capabilities in studying the past. Thanks to contemporary scientific advancements, we now have the opportunity to trace the early years of Islam's development and carefully uncover secrets hidden for centuries deep within history. Leading universities, museums, and libraries actively upload ancient manuscripts, archaeological records, and documents into the internet, opening new horizons for scientists and curious researchers. Today, even the most ancient manuscripts can be studied without leaving home, with just a few mouse clicks. Additionally, modern satellite technologies enable scientists to precisely locate archaeological sites and gather detailed information about ancient cities and settlements. All this information spreads rapidly worldwide through social media, scientific forums, and information platforms, facilitating more open and extensive discussions. Thus, we are witnesses to the dawn of a new era of research related to the origins and early history of Islam. We have a unique opportunity to reconstruct events that took place on the Arabian Peninsula many centuries ago, using advanced methods and modern technologies. One prominent researcher who has dedicated his life to studying this topic is scholar and historian Dan Gibson. This expert has deeply delved into the study of peoples and places that existed in the ancient Middle East prior to the emergence of Islam. In the early 1920s, he first traveled to Arabia, and over the following 30 years of his journeys and research, he collected an extensive amount of material, evidence, and testimonies supporting his radical yet revolutionary theory regarding the origins of religion. In his works, Gibson concludes that the modern territory of Saudi Arabia was the birthplace of the Islamic religion. In 2002, I had the opportunity to attend a Nubian research conference organized by the prestigious Al Hussein bin Talal University. There, in the academic environment, I was able to communicate with leading archaeologists representing Saudi Arabia and Jordan. I was particularly interested in the archaeological findings in the holy city of Mecca. During the conversation, I asked them several questions, avoiding mentioning their names or quoting their words. They honestly admitted to me that until around the year 800 CE, no archaeological artifacts had been found in Mecca that would testify to the life and development of this city. This surprised me because I expected to hear that archaeologists had discovered ancient houses, orchards, public buildings, or even temples that would confirm the existence of material culture in this place. However, my interlocutors clearly stated that nothing of the sort had been found. You probably know that the name Mecca is mentioned only once in the Islamic holy book, the Quran. The information contained within links this name to various meanings: a forbidden place for gatherings, a sacred house, or the site of the Kaaba. Today, words like house, dwelling, prayer, and the sensations associated with this ancient city have become ingrained in the consciousness of believers and have become an integral part of it. The word Quran itself does not provide direct indications that all the events associated with this sacred work took place specifically in this city. In Islamic sources and among Muslim scholars, it is generally considered that this question is not of particular importance and is usually not a matter for discussion. Nevertheless, in recent years, some historians and researchers have raised questions and begun to doubt traditional beliefs. Some of them note that, in their opinion, Mecca was a rather isolated focal point for its time and was not situated on important trade routes of antiquity. There was a common belief that caravans moving through the sands and deserts carried perfumes, spices, precious stones, and other exotic goods back and forth. These caravans connected different regions and facilitated trade that supported large cities. However, according to modern research, by the time of Muhammad's appearance, around the 6th century CE, the so-called Ladan era, the period of dominance of aromatic trees and fragrant woods, had already come to an end. Part 3 of 39. The Arabs of that time shifted their focus to trading goods such as leather and textiles, which were more accessible and easier to transport. It would be doubtful to claim that these commodities alone could have transformed Mecca into a major trading hub, as its description depicted a city regarded as the mother of all cities, a key node and center of important routes. On the trade route map, it is already evident that 3 significant regions in North Arabia could have claimed the role of trading centers, but Mecca is not among them. In our film, we will try to understand why archaeologists have yet to find a single genuine archaeological artifact in Mecca, dating from the time of Prophet Muhammad. We will also discuss why descriptions of Mecca in surviving texts differ from its actual landscape, and how internal conflicts and civil disputes that arose before and during the birth of Islam distorted the perception of historical events related to this religious movement. Despite the fact that millions of Muslims worldwide consider Mecca a holy city and its founders as eminent figures, British researcher Dan Gibson has put forward a view that contradicts traditional perspectives. In his scholarly work, he has found evidence suggesting that Islam itself was not formed in Mecca, but rather in the territories of North Arabia. No scholar has ever doubted the sacred status of this city, since all Muslims traditionally consider praying facing the Black Stone in Mecca as obligatory, and regard it as their spiritual capital. However, years of traveling across the Arabian Peninsula, along with studying archaeological and historical sources, led Gibson to unexpected conclusions. He is convinced that there has been a serious error in our perception of Islamic history, not a deliberate lie, but rather a result of misunderstandings and incomplete data that emerged during the early formation of the religion. Later, due to mistakes made in subsequent texts and historical records, Islamic scholars and writers attempted to correct these inaccuracies. However, they often only reinforced existing misconceptions, sometimes failing to verify facts or fully understand their true meaning. This raises the question: do the over 1 billion Muslims who follow Islam truly understand how and where their faith originated? Or perhaps many live under the impression of a city and event that do not quite correspond to the truth? If so, what consequences might this have for an ordinary Muslim trying to follow the teachings of Prophet Muhammad if their understanding of the origins is based on unreliable data? The answer can only be found by delving into the historical and cultural context of the era in which this religion emerged, an era about which many of us know very little. Over the centuries since then, much attention has been given to ancient civilizations and Near Eastern empires, while the history of Arabia has largely remained in the shadows. Part 4 of 39. This ignorance is characteristic not only of Western countries, which often pay insufficient attention to the history of the peninsula, but also of the Arabs themselves. Prophet Muhammad was born in the year 570 of our era, a period about which very little is known today. He appeared in Mecca in a family engaged in trade with merchants from Nabat, an ancient tribe to which the southern Arab traders belonged. Soon, he married a merchant woman who helped him in business and connected him to the trading world. During meditations in a well-known cave located near the city, he was visited by an angel who taught him to praise Allah. Later, Muhammad's wife convinced him of the sincerity of this vision, and he believed that a divine messenger had truly appeared before him, called to make him a prophet and to lead his people along the true path. This story, full of spiritual experiences and mystical encounters, marked the beginning of a new religious movement that eventually altered the course of world history. Muhammad repeatedly met the same angel and each time received new revelations, which were subsequently collected into the holy book of Muslims, the Quran. These revelations, conveyed to him throughout his life, became the primary source for the writing and shaping of the very essence of Islamic faith. His teachings did not emerge suddenly, but resulted from a long internal dialogue with higher powers and spiritual revelations revealed to him through numerous encounters with the angel who served as God's messenger. Each of these meetings brought new knowledge, expanded understanding, and strengthened him in his spiritual mission. Ardel received education at an Islamic college located in Kuwait, where he immersed himself in studying the fundamentals of religion, history, and culture of Islam. Over the years of study at this institution, he was recognized and loved by his future friend, Dan. Together, they frequently discussed profound questions of faith, explored historical events related to prophecy and the rise of the Islamic religion. These conversations helped them better understand not only religion, but also the role of mankind in the world, their spiritual development, and their responsibility for their actions. Muhammad, along with his followers, faced numerous persecutions, which forced him and his followers to leave Mecca and migrate to Medina. This event became a turning point in Islamic history, as it was in Medina that the first Muslim caliphate was established. There, an institution of governance was created, and a religious community formed that accepted Islam as its faith. Medina became the first city on the Arabian Peninsula where Islam gained widespread influence and recognition. This city became, in a way, the center of the new religion, symbolizing the beginning of Muslim history. It is in Medina that the Muslim calendar begins, an epochal point from which all subsequent events are counted. Soon after the founding of the new community, the Prophet's followers began active efforts to spread their faith. They began attacking trade caravans, which contributed to strengthening their military power and increasing their influence. The continuous growth of their followers and territorial expansion gradually transformed them into a formidable military force that encompassed almost the entire Arabian Peninsula. United under a common idea, they managed to create an organized and capable movement capable of standing against external enemies. Muhammad, inspired by his mission and the desire to spread Islam worldwide, suddenly passed away. His death was a heavy blow to his followers, sparking a wave of disputes and disagreements that over time developed into civil conflicts and internal strife. Despite all the disagreements, the spirit of the dream of all-encompassing faith and uniting believers under a single banner did not fade. On the contrary, the idea continued to live in the minds and hearts of his supporters. Over time, Islam spread far beyond the Arabian Peninsula, conquering significant territories, including parts of North Africa and Central Asia. Today, this religion is recognized as the second largest in the world, second only to Christianity. Millions of people profess Islam, observe its commandments, and continue to spread its teachings. In the Middle East, especially in places where active construction is ongoing, a representative of the Ministry of Antiquities is invariably present during preparations for an awkward foundation work. His task is to ensure that unique cultural layers are not damaged during excavations, and that wherever work is carried out, whether in Jerusalem, Damascus, or Amman, there is always a chance to discover ancient artifacts or ruins. These sites, filled with history, contain evidence of long-gone eras. In Mecca, Saudi Arabia, where new modern buildings such as hotels, business centers, and other infrastructure objects are actively being constructed, archaeologists are surprised by the absence of ruins from an ancient city. According to their findings, no obvious signs of a once large civilization are found beneath the modern metropolis. Mecca, known as the center of the Islamic world and the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, was in ancient times a major settlement capable of supporting its residents, caravans, and military forces, thanks to its rich trade routes and strategic location. Moreover, the city was famous for its agricultural activity, cultivating various crops and raising livestock. According to Islamic traditions, Prophet Muhammad traveled considerable distances, reaching the mountains and valleys of Mecca, as described in detail in the Hadiths. His wife Aisha recounted how one day, a man longing for his homeland and dreaming of spending the night in a valley, filled his heart with sadness and nostalgia for Mecca, despite the long distances. Finally, upon arriving in Mecca, they saw a city blessed with water, greenery, and trees, which seemed a miracle in such a harsh climate. Part 6 of 39. The city, filled with trees and grasses, appeared as an oasis of tranquility amid barren desert plains, and staying there evoked a special feeling of happiness and relief. Al-Bukhari recounts the story of a prisoner who, despite being chained, was able to eat grapes, something considered incredible even in those difficult times, especially in such a harsh place as Mecca. Around this city lies a rocky, arid desert where rain falls with moderate frequency, less than 10 centimeters of precipitation annually. High temperatures and poor soil conditions made agriculture and living conditions extremely difficult for a large population. Despite these natural hardships, Mecca continues to be a sacred and vital religious center. It is described as a place rich in vegetation, fertile soil, fields with trees, trembling grasses, and gardens, though this description contradicts the current natural conditions. There are no areas around the city suitable for agriculture or development, which somewhat contradicts ancient descriptions of Mecca as a fertile and blessed land where life and growth prospered. Ibn Ashaq notes that in ancient times, the inhabitants of Mecca avoided cutting down trees in their sacred places, linking them to a special status and holiness. While evidence of forests and vegetation in ancient times could be obtained by examining pollen remains in preserved, untouched soil layers, such evidence is now absent. It is nearly impossible today to find even clues of trees existing in ancient Mecca, since archaeological excavations and research have yet to confirm the presence of even the simplest plants there in prehistoric times. Moreover, another mystery arises. Mecca is marked on the earliest maps of Arabia. It would seem logical to assume that a major trading city, playing a key role in regional relations and the economy, would be depicted on ancient maps created several centuries before Islam's emergence. However, surprisingly, none of the cartographic records preserved to this day contain any mention of Mecca prior to this historical period. My personal research, which involved collecting and carefully studying numerous copies of ancient maps of the Arab world, confirms that none of the sources created before the rise of Islam mention this name. It is particularly noteworthy that the first appearance of the name Mecca in literary sources occurs only around the year 45 CE, 230 years after Islam began to spread. Does it not seem remarkable that during all this time, neighboring peoples or cultures were unaware of such an important center capable of attracting thousands of people, even during the early days of Islam? Part 7 of 39. How could a large city, with mighty fortress walls, temples, public buildings, and a developed infrastructure, remain almost unnoticed by neighboring peoples who traded with all corners of the region. How could it, despite numerous conditions, serve as a pilgrimage center and a major trading hub while appearing so insignificant and failing to appear in the chronicles of neighboring civilizations? When analyzing the location of this presumed ancient city, one cannot help but notice that there is very little archaeological evidence of its existence, or none at all. In the extensive soil layers studied through excavations, there are no noticeable signs of ancient structures or remnants of trees. The site was likely sparsely populated, insignificant, and perhaps not even situated on major trade routes, entirely contrary to how we imagined it. Many modern historians and archaeologists conclude that stories associated with Islamic history may be purely mythological or invented in later centuries. Evidence of this lies in significant discrepancies between what Islamic sources report and the actual archaeological findings, providing grounds to doubt the reliability of these writings. Consequently, many scholars believe that many of these texts are more like fictional myths or legends, rather than factual historical evidence. It is quite probable that such stories were created without firm basis, aiming to lend religion or culture a more significant and mystical image. Over years of study, I have come to a deeper conviction. Although at first glance these accounts seem to be myths, it is quite possible that they describe a different place, one fully matching the characteristics provided in various sources. This led me to consider that Muhammad may have been born and raised somewhat in a different region, not in the Mecca described in traditional history. It is quite likely that modern Muslims, following established rituals, face not the exact correct direction when praying, because their true place of birth or the place associated with their religion could have been in another region. A key symbol in pre-Islamic Arabia was the Kaaba, a temple revered as a sacred site and a pilgrimage center in the region. An effective starting point for reconstructing the history of these ancient religious practices is to study the period before Islam's emergence. That is, the time when idols stood in Arabia and religious rites associated with polytheism were performed. The main pilgrimage center during those times was a holy gathering place where numerous idols were concentrated. Idols worshipped by the native Arabs, as well as other pagan cult objects. This important fact helps us understand what the religious landscape was like in those distant times, and what these sacred sites meant to the people. To understand what was happening in the pre-Islamic Arabian era, it is necessary to continue studying this topic. It is especially important to grasp the role that holy sites played in the lives of ancient Arabs, and how these sites were connected to their conceptions of deities. Since ancient times, religions in the Middle East have always been associated with specific lands and places, assigning these locations a special and universal significance. Modern scholars, long influenced by Greek and Roman mythological ideas about gods and the pantheon, often underestimate the importance that the ancient Arabs themselves attributed to the lands and regions, considering them sacred not only in a religious sense but also culturally. This approach helps to better understand what exactly was considered sacred by them in these lands, and how this influenced their religious beliefs and practices. Among the ancient Arabs, there was a multitude of gods worshipped in various regions such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and other lands. Merchants and travelers, continuously roaming these lands, consistently showed respect for local deities, building their relationships on mutual regard and recognition. At the same time, they often did not conflict with the gods of other peoples, demonstrating tolerance and respect for different religious traditions. However, a key distinction in their beliefs was the complete denial of the idea of a god dwelling in human or animal form. For example, one god might be depicted as a simple cube, while another in the shape of a triangle. Each was regarded as a local, special deity, and such sacred images were venerated when entering certain territories. Thus, predefined rules of respect applied to lands where these cult objects were located. As a result, the spiritual approach to religion created natural conditions whereby specific regions and sacred sites acquired a special status. They became places of particular reverence, sacred spaces associated with certain gods. The territory surrounding temples, usually situated in valleys or secluded desert corners, could be regarded as a sacred zone. In such places, people gathered even with enemies, feeling safe and at peace because violence was prohibited on sacred lands, thus violating customary tribal laws. Often, while traveling through the picturesque and majestic landscapes of southern Jordan, such as in Ad Ram, people could not ignore the stunning natural beauty of the surrounding forms, high mountains, smooth rocks, and the silent power of nature. They were captivated especially by this natural beauty and the grandeur of the scenery, which sometimes made them forget about the temple, dedicated to the goddess Alat, known by some as one of the primary deities in the Old Testament. This Nabatean temple had in front of it a sacred space extending over a wide territory, with the surrounding mountains serving as its natural boundaries. Before the advent of Islam, during the pre-Islamic era, Arab tribes consisted of numerous independent groups. Each had its own gods to worship over the centuries and to whom they showed reverence, often quarreling with neighbors over intertribal disputes or rivalry. The only unifying factor in such a context was pilgrimage to a common ancient site, known as Masjid al-Haram. This term translates as the forbidden place of gathering. The word Majja means assembly or gathering, and was later used to refer to prayer locations, mosques. However, before the appearance of Islam, mosques as such did not yet exist, and initially these were simply public or sacred spaces where people gathered. These holy areas provided protection and a sense of safety, encouraging people to set aside worldly affairs and prohibiting acts of violence. They emphasized a special status, a place where one was allowed to pause, forget earthly concerns, and engage on a higher level of interaction. The concept of haram, meaning a forbidden or sacred territory, played a crucial role in Islamic religion. Allah, the one God of Islam, declared Mecca a sacred city, even in the earliest times, and this status remained unchanged after the birth and spread of Islam. On this holy land, it was forbidden to cut down trees, break bushes, hunt game, or engage in any other forms of farming or hunting activities that would violate its sacred nature. Regarding the characteristic features of the first sacred city of Islam, it can be described as a place that at that time served as a forbidden zone, a space where killing and any form of violence were categorically prohibited. This city functioned as a center of pilgrimages and spiritual gatherings long before the religion itself appeared, establishing its status as a sacred site. In this context, it is important to understand that many of the ideas concerning Mecca initially did not appear on the maps or in literary sources of that time, and no one suspected its significance as a center of religious life. After all, descriptions of Mecca as a major trading hub, an ancestral city, and a site of ancient pilgrimages are post-factum interpretations that emerged after the formation of the new religion and its dissemination. To truly unravel this mystery and understand it, one must turn to the essence of Islam itself and see how it transformed the images, myths, and traditions existing in the ancient Arab world. In the modern world, most people unambiguously state that the direction of prayer, or Qibla, for Muslims points towards the holy city of Mecca, located in Saudi Arabia. However, according to the Islamic Holy Scripture, the Quran, initially, Muslims were instructed to pray facing a particular place, though it does not explicitly specify the name of a specific city or the exact coordinates of the original Qibla. The text mentions only the concept of Masjid al-Haram, a sacred site or forbidden territory designated for prayer. This prompts reflection that initially Muslims faced Jerusalem when praying, as this direction was long considered sacred for Muslim believers. According to numerous Islamic sources, an important change occurred in the year 634 AD, during the prophetic mission of Muhammad, when it was decided to change the Qibla from Jerusalem to Mecca. This event is explicitly mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah of the Quran, where Allah states, "Indeed, we have seen the turning of your face toward the heaven, and we will make you pleased with your Qibla." This was a truly significant and historically important event, a shift that altered the customary ritual and pointed to a new spiritual center. However, it is important to remember that Allah never makes the actions of believers futile or meaningless. Therefore, if in accordance with religious traditions it is more convenient for you, it is now especially important to observe mercy and face the Masjid al-Haram, regardless of where you are on the planet. As a historian focusing on the Arabian Peninsula, I have always been particularly interested in the question, in which exact direction did Prophet Muhammad pray before the Qibla was changed? This issue has stirred the minds of scholars, many of whom assumed that Muslims initially faced Jerusalem, while others believed it was the direction of Syria, and still others hypothesized some less obvious orientation. Likely, if we had conducted such research a century ago, spending an entire life and many resources, we would have been forced to undertake numerous journeys around the world in search of ancient monuments that testify to the original prayer direction of early Muslims. In those times, studying such historical details was extremely difficult. It required searching for and analyzing manuscripts, visiting ancient mosques, for example, in desert towns of Kazakhstan or in the Middle East. But today, technological advances have made it possible to conduct such research in just a few minutes. Using satellite imagery available through search engines and platforms like Google Maps has completely transformed the approach to studying historical past. Modern tools allow us to observe the layout of urban and architectural objects, examine their structure from space, and draw conclusions about the time of their construction. In collaboration with research centers comprising hundreds of students and teachers, we can establish the chronology of the emergence of various mosques, determine their architectural features, and, most importantly, identify the direction they were oriented toward. During the data analysis process, we combine Google's navigation capabilities with archival information, correlating the obtained data to understand when and in which direction the Qibla was changed, whether after a specific historical event or as a result of architectural modifications. It is worth noting that precisely determining the Qibla direction is not always easy. Many early mosques, especially those built in antiquity, did not have a strict square shape, and their walls were often more irregular or curved. Researchers must identify the wall closest to the Qibla and calculate a 90-degree angle to it, which is not always simple, as ancient builders used various methods to determine the direction. When buildings were constructed without modern construction standards, such as square shapes or exact angles, determining the precise orientation with monochrome or precise measurement was very difficult. For more accurate research, there is another, more reliable and modern method: visiting the mosque in person and using modern GPS devices, which allow for highly precise directional determination. However, not all mosques are suitable for such measurements, especially if they have undergone numerous reconstructions, restorations, or rebuilding over the centuries. Many of them have been completely altered or expanded, making it more difficult to identify their original Qibla direction. Despite these challenges, some mosques have preserved their original structure, and they can be used to reconstruct historical data. For example, in Medina, there is a special mosque called the Mosque of the Two Qiblas, because it was here that the direction of prayer was changed from Jerusalem to Mecca. Studies indicate that this was the site of the historic act of changing the Qibla, and this mosque is considered a key monument in the history of the Islamic community. Thus, using modern technologies, historical archives, and architectural research, we can trace the evolution of the Muslim prayer direction, from initial orientations to the changes implemented more than a century and a half after the emergence of Islam. All these methods enable us to reconstruct and verify historical facts with high accuracy, understand how Islamic practices evolved, and how cultural and religious traditions changed over the centuries. One of the worshippers, faced with the necessity to change the direction, had to turn and bow toward Mecca. In Islamic tradition, there is a clear and established explanation for the initial Qibla orientation. According to Islamic beliefs, the original Qibla was the city of Jerusalem. The modern mosque, serving as a guide for Muslims during prayer, is now oriented toward Mecca. Part 12 of 39. However, the history of this matter includes a period when the mosque was entirely destroyed to allow a new structure to be built in its place. During archaeological excavations, an old foundation was discovered. Foundations of the original buildings and evidence that the Qibla wall initially pointed north, directly toward Jerusalem. This confirms the ancient tradition that the original direction for Muslim prayer was Jerusalem, not Mecca, as it is understood today. For a deeper understanding, one can examine the earliest mosques constructed on the Earth's surface and study their orientation. By mapping them and comparing the lines of their direction, three possible scenarios emerge. Either they point in different directions, all precisely face Jerusalem, or each one is oriented toward a different location. 11 ancient mosques that have survived to this day are especially significant. They are located in countries such as China, Egypt, southern and central Jordan, Yemen, Israel, Iraq, Jerusalem on the West Bank, and Lebanon. If arranged in chronological order based on their construction dates, the second among them is the mosque, located in Guangzhou, formerly called Canton. This city has a rich history of connections with the Arab world. When Marco Polo arrived there in the 14th century, he found over 100,000 Arab and Persian traders living and conducting business. Over the centuries, Arabs traded with China, a well-documented fact in history. The renowned traveler and trader Abu Waqas, the uncle of Prophet Muhammad, traveled to China as part of a trade mission. According to Chinese historical chronicles, in 628 AD, 6 years after the emergence of Islam, he built a mosque there for Arab merchants. I personally visited this mosque and determined its orientation using modern GPS equipment. It was astonishing. It was not aligned toward Mecca. Its Qibla pointed south, roughly 12 degrees northward. This indicated that initially the direction was south of the direction to Mecca, and apparently was oriented toward Jerusalem. The next well-known mosque, built approximately 20 years after the advent of Islam, was established in the city of Fustat, located near Cairo. Its architecture and layout underwent multiple reconstructions and expansions, so the original foundations are no longer visible. However, written descriptions of the original plan remain, stating that initially the direction of the Qibla was oriented to the east, that is, toward Jerusalem. Later, due to the development of Islam and changes in religious rituals, it was redesigned and shifted southward toward Mecca. Another significant example is the palace of the Umayyad dynasty, built in the city of Huma in southern Jordan around the year 700 AD, which means that approximately 80 years after the emergence of Islam, a large and important architectural structure was constructed there. In this location, the Abbas family, close to power, built a spacious mansion. Although there was no specifically designated mosque within the building, the faithful gathered in the courtyard to pray. This is evidence that during those years, the Muslim place of worship was still in the process of formation and development, and local traditions and architectural solutions often differed from modern canon. An interesting aspect related to the Qibla can be observed in this text. However, it does not point to Jerusalem. The following year, a new mosque was built in the city of Baalbek in Lebanon. Surprisingly, its Qibla is not oriented towards Mecca, raising questions and new interpretations. Another year later, in the capital of Jordan, Amman, an impressive religious complex was constructed, a mosque located within a citadel. This mosque is oriented south, directly toward Mecca. Several years later, in 705 AD, another magnificent mosque was built there, in the capital of Yemen. Although traditionally its direction would point to Mecca, it actually faces west of Jerusalem. In subsequent years, specifically in 706 AD, Muslim rulers of the Umayyad dynasty created a large palace complex in Israel at Khirbat al-Minya, located on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Within this complex, a separate room served as a mosque, confirming its religious purpose. An inscription on the gates states that this palace was built 787 years after the emergence of Islam by order of the ruler Al-Walid. Interestingly, neither the building itself nor its mosque were oriented toward Jerusalem, although it was long believed that the Qibla should point there. In the same year, another mosque was built in the city of Wasit in Iraq, initially perceived as a line towards Jerusalem. However, more detailed archaeological studies revealed that its orientation was rather southward and not towards the center of the current holy sites. Another important mosque is Al-Aqsa, located in Jerusalem itself. It is not the Dome of the Rock, but an older structure situated south of this sacred site, which also points toward Mecca, although it is not directly aligned with it. In 724 AD, more than a century after the rise of Islam, the Khirbat al-Mauda Mosque was built near Jericho, in the Jordan Valley. The palace where it is located was constructed at the end of Umayyad rule. Plan analysis shows that both the palace and the mosque were oriented more toward the south than toward Mecca. In the same year, another mosque appeared in the city of Anjar, approximately 6 3/4 kilometers from Beirut. It was built at the end of the Umayyad era, but only 30 years later it fell into decline and was abandoned because no one restored it. Apparently, the Qibla direction of this mosque did not point toward Mecca or Jerusalem. All these facts allow us to imagine a map where all the specified mosques are located. The result was quite surprising. In the first 100 years after the emergence of Islam, exactly 100 mosques were constructed, and each of them had a Qibla that did not point to Mecca or Jerusalem. They were all oriented in the same direction, directly south of Jordan. Quite different from today's practices. This is not a mere coincidence or mistake. All the mosques preserved to this day are aligned toward one specific location situated precisely beneath that point: the ancient city of Petra. Today, Petra is considered one of the most remarkable tourist landmarks, attracting visitors from around the world who come to admire its majestic temples and tombs carved into the rocks. But this raises a question. Could it be that Petra is actually the key site, that according to certain historical and religious sources can truly be called the mother of all ancient cities? Perhaps it occupies the position traditionally assigned to Mecca or Jerusalem. This opens new horizons for contemplating the origins of the Qibla direction and the ancient roots that connected faith and history. Petra, an ancient and impressive city, was once a center of Arab pilgrimage, drawing thousands of believers with its sacred significance and historical importance. In this context, a question arises. Could Petra also be considered the birthplace of Prophet Muhammad and the city that laid the foundations of Islam? Many respectable Muslims continue to assert that in ancient times, Muslims prayed toward Jerusalem, and they are well aware of this because it is documented in ancient Islamic sources, such as collections of hadith by Bukhari. I fully agree with the opinion of researcher Mukhari, who specifically names Jerusalem as the sacred point toward which Muslims pointed at that time. However, it is important to consider that the Italian scholar Bukhari wrote approximately 200 years after the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, and therefore his information may contain inaccuracies or historical mistakes. Moreover, Bukhari indicates that he consolidates various recollections and reports received from people who lived at different times, and he was not a direct eyewitness to those events. His accounts are more like compilations of traditions and popular ideas of that era, often contradictory to each other. One day, when some Muslims came to the morning prayer in Gubare, a place likely close to Medina, a man approached them and delivered astonishing news that on that very evening, the Prophet Muhammad received a command to change the direction of prayer towards the Kaaba located in Mecca. At that time, the faces of the worshippers were turned towards Syria in the direction of the ancient Petra, which was in the Roman province of Syria. Upon hearing this new revelation, they turned their faces toward the Kaaba. Thus, it can be suggested that initially, Muhammad, living in Medina, prayed facing north, toward Petra, or more precisely, toward the region where ancient Petra was situated. By the time the hadith collections of Bukhari began to be compiled, over 100 years after this event, the memory of Petra had almost faded, but knowledge persisted that in ancient times, Muslim prayers were directed toward Syria. Therefore, the question of the original direction of prayer remains relevant for historians and theologians. Some researchers pose an intriguing question about the origin of the name, Bek. After all, the word Bek became synonymous with the first holy city of Islam, the Kaaba, thus permanently securing a special place for it in religious tradition. There, in his youth, Muhammad and others found stone blocks with inscriptions in the Syrian language during the reconstruction of the destroyed Kaaba, indicating its ancient connection to that region. According to legend, these inscriptions contained a translation from a Jewish translator who possibly was well versed in the language of the Batians, an ancient Semitic dialect. One such inscription read, "I am Allah, the Lord of Biki. I created it on the day I created the sky and the earth, the sun and the moon. I surrounded it with a family of pious angels, and it shall remain as long as its two mountains stand, as a blessing for its people, with milk and water." Concerning the origin of the word Bek, it derives from an ancient Semitic root, meaning to cry or to lament, which is no accident. This could signify that this place, seemingly the point where people expressed their emotions, grief, or prayer, held special significance. It should be emphasized that the word Bek was never used in ancient sources to denote Jerusalem. In the Bible, it appears only once in Psalm 84, where it is called the Valley of Achor, or the Valley of Weeping. The Quran also mentions the Valley of Weeping, where Hagar bitterly mourned and searched for water for her son Isaac, Ishmael. Interestingly, this story is linked to the term Bek in the context of the associated locations and symbolism. Previously, the place where the Kaaba was built was called Kawar, not Jerusalem, as it was situated in a valley, unlike Jerusalem, which occupies a mountain peak. In my view, the answer to the question about the connection between Petra and the origins of Islam seems quite evident. There are numerous records of powerful earthquakes in the history of this region, one of which occurred in 1500 Palm years, that is, just 19 years before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. According to archaeological evidence, during this natural disaster, a large part of Petra was destroyed and obliterated. It is therefore quite logical to assume that Petra could have been considered the Bekaa Valley, an area where significant losses among its population occurred due to natural catastrophes. Over the centuries, many people have perished in this area from earthquakes and other calamities, and the region itself might have been called something similar to Bekaa Valley, perhaps because it contains evidence of severe natural disasters and the stories of human suffering associated with them. When considering Petra as a sacred city of Islam, it is obvious that there must be convincing evidence that Muhammad's tribes, especially the Quraysh, lived specifically in this region. It is crucial that such proof is confirmed by a sufficiently authoritative researcher, capable of demonstrating that the Prophet's birthplace was not Mecca, but rather the area surrounding Petra. If D. Gibson could present such evidence, it would significantly support his hypothesis. According to his assumptions, Muhammad came from the region around Petra, not from Mecca. Previously, this area was known as Khawer, or Humu, as modern researchers now call it. Archaeological excavations here have revealed farmsteads belonging to the Abbasid family, as well as evidence of mosque construction from later periods. Historically, it is said that after the Muslims of Iraq defeated the Aramaic army of Damascus, there arose a need to legitimize the new authority, and for this purpose, one of Muhammad's family members was to become a link between religion and state. Accordingly, Muslims traveled to Humu, located just 37 kilometers from Petra, the place where, it seems, the Prophet's family and the Quraysh tribe resided. Notably, they went there rather than to Mecca or Medina, which suggests that the original centers of the Islamic faith might have been in this region. Inai, which later became a sacred city. Today, it is known that most early mosques in Islam were oriented toward ancient Petra, which allows us to assume that its description somewhat corresponds to the original image of the sacred city. But another important question arises. How well does the city of Petra truly match the characteristics described as the original sacred center of Islam? In this context, it is interesting to recall the story told by all early biographies of the Prophet Muhammad about his father, Abdullah. One well-known scene is the fact that one day, while working in the fields, he returned home with dirt-stained hands, highlighting his hard work and connection to the earth. When entering the house of his first wife, he offered her to spend the night with him, but she refused because his hands were dirty with soil. After that, he went out, washed his hands, and when he returned, he was clean again. Subsequent stories describe the conception and birth of Muhammad, and an important aspect of these accounts is the use of the same Arabic words to denote both the land and the soil, especially the land used for cultivation or fields. These stories always emphasize that the Prophet's father, Abdullah, had a close connection to the land, which initially appears logical and natural. However, there is a significant nuance related to geographical conditions. Around Mecca, there were no arable lands suitable for cultivation. The area was dominated by wastelands, rocky patches, and barren desert spaces unsuitable for agriculture. In contrast, archaeological findings in the Petra region indicate that this location was not merely a neglected piece of land, but a full-fledged city with irrigated lands, gardens, and plantations. Archaeologists discovered that there were private and public orchards, fortified water channels, and water supply systems via aqueducts and clay pipes. Excavations revealed cultural layers with remains of fruit trees, vineyards, and gardens. All evidence of advanced farming systems and the presence of trees that historically contributed to the creation of fertile areas. Even today, if one draws a line between Petra and Al-Ula, located just 5 kilometers apart, cultivated lands with scattered orchards and modest strips of farmland are clearly visible. Researchers studying ancient soils and soil layers have found that only a century ago, the hills around Petra were covered in dense greenery. Oaks, junipers, pistachios, and various bushes created a picturesque green landscape. These green plantings gave the surroundings a special vitality and fertility. In contrast, in sacred Mecca, besides stone and sandy surfaces, there were trees and low vegetation, and the area was enclosed by walls. Ibn Ishaq states that Mecca was surrounded by ramparts that provided natural protection. However, modern scholars question the accuracy of this statement, as such defensive structures did not exist in Mecca at that time. It is possible that the mention refers to defenses within the city or some observation points, rather than a full enclosure by walls. As for the city of Petra, it was situated in a deep valley surrounded by steep, high mountains and rugged cliffs. These natural barriers served as excellent protection against enemies and created a natural obstacle encircling the city from all sides. The inhabitants of Petra used the rocky cliffs to build defensive walls, stretching from one rock to another, forming formidable fortifications that served as a kind of barrier, ensuring the safety of the city. These natural shelters and man-made walls made Petra inaccessible to external enemies, which explains its longevity and resilience through the centuries. It was this natural defensive system that became the most important factor in the city's history, and its architecture and fortifications bear testimony to its strategic significance in ancient times, enabling it to maintain its independence and strength for many centuries. Thanks to this, Petra was able to create the impression of genuine city walls that protected its inhabitants from external dangers. An extraordinary feature of this ancient city is also a unique stream flowing in its vicinity. Usually, in valleys surrounded by high mountains, a stream runs through the center of the inhabited area, creating a natural water artery. However, in Petra's case, the situation is different. An ancient earthquake that occurred in deep antiquity caused a crack in the mountain massif. Mountain water seeps through this crack and flows across the valley, emerging on the other side. This natural phenomenon served as the basis for the construction of key engineering structures. A wide road was built in the valley, connecting two mountain peaks, and alongside it, a rainwater collection channel was constructed, running along this route. Right now, I suggest we go there and see it all with our own eyes. In Islam, pilgrims are required to perform a ritual prescribed by tradition, to walk 7 times between the two holy mountains, Marwa and Safa. It is already known that, according to the account given in al-Bukhari's collection, Prophet Muhammad decided to perform this rite by running along the bed of the rain stream between these two rocks. However, the situation described in the sources raises certain questions and doubts, since the current state of Marwa and Safa consists of rocky outcroppings, small stone formations within the mosque, and no water flow has existed between them for several centuries. Nonetheless, there is a place that could quite possibly correspond to this ancient description. In Petra itself, there are 4 paths leading to what is called the Basin. Given that the city is located in a deep valley, it could be accessed from any of its ends. During the Battle of Mecca, the Prophet entered the city through its upper entrance, but there were also several other approaches. Ancient texts mention that the holy city could be reached via a crack in the rocks, called Tana in Arabic. Al-Bukhari repeatedly states that the Messenger of Allah entered Mecca through this pass, coming from Hajar, and leaving the city through the same route. The Prophet continued his journey until he reached a place known as Taniya, an entrance relatively hidden, leading to the Quraysh people. Part 19 of 39. There are 2 entrances in Taniya. One is the famous Sikovsky Pass, which tourists use to enter the city, and the other is hidden on the far side behind a street with columns. This entrance leads into a complex maze of canyons, ultimately connecting to the waters of the Dead Sea. In Petra, many temples have been preserved, including the Temple of the Winged Lions and the Al-Uzza Temple, dedicated to the deity Al-Uzza. Behind me lies a temple dedicated to the god Dushara, an ancient sanctuary situated on the slopes of this mountain range. Once, this range was a center of worship for this deity. At its very heart was the El Dussara Temple, which served as a vital spiritual center. Ibn Hisham recounts an interesting story related to the early spread of Islam in this region. At that time, few people had already embraced Islam. Among them was At-Tufal bin Ammar from Mecca, converted to Islam during one of his journeys, and upon returning home, his wife also decided to take the same step. She advised her wife to visit the temple, bathe, and purify herself in its waters to align with the new religious requirements. In the sacred zone, there was a water spring where ablutions took place, an important part of religious purification. After that, she returned home to learn more about the new faith. This story could have taken place either in Mecca, which is thousands of kilometers from here, and where such sanctuaries might also exist, or in Petra. If it had happened in Mecca, her wife could have visited a temple, washed herself, and then set out on her journey again. However, it should be noted that in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca, such grand temples carved into the rocks have not survived to this day. There are no picturesque streams of water protected by city walls, lush greenery, or abundant vegetation that could be described in detail. All of this is associated with Petra and holds a significant place in its history. During the first 100 years, all attention in every mosque of the Islamic world was focused on the sacred place called Masjid al-Haram, which was located here in Petra. It can be said that there is no other city in the world that matches this description so precisely, as Petra embodies all the characteristics and legends of the sacred abode. Meanwhile, in the struggle to defend it, Al-Haktab destroyed it to such a high degree that the city was forced to retreat to the upper streets located on the hill. According to legends, one day, Prophet Muhammad set out on a journey to reach Mecca, and along the way, stopped at Mount Hira, which faces the city. Interestingly, in this description, Mount Hira is indeed located at the top of Mecca, and can serve as a reference point for understanding ancient stories. However, if one were to go to Mecca today and look at the Hira cave, it can be observed that its entrance is no longer directly facing the city, and its orientation differs from descriptions from earlier times. Unlike Mecca, where the land and the position of the cave have changed over time, the situation in Petra appears to be different. The higher part of the city occupies the area north of the colonnaded street, while the lower part is to the south. This street, adorned with columns, divides the city into two parts, and if one agrees with the hypothesis that Petra is the sacred city of Mecca, then this is precisely where the cave should be located, the place where Prophet Muhammad received his first revelation. According to ancient records, this cave was positioned so that its entrance faced the city, with the entry pointing towards the need to ascend the mountain and then descend, symbolizing a spiritual journey. If this hypothesis is correct, I am almost certain I know its exact coordinates, and an exciting journey to this holy site awaits. Inside the cave, numerous symbols and signs believed to be divine remain, and above the entrance rises a majestic crescent moon symbol. It was here that young people sought answers to eternal questions about the meaning of life, reflecting and meditating. The description and location of this cave fully correspond to ancient records stating that such a sacred place was located near the city, with its entrance facing it. This confirms that people long ago spent time in worship and deep contemplation precisely at this site. I am convinced that it is one of the most sacred and revered sites in all of Islam, and it is located exactly here, in Petra. According to the commandments of the Quran, during prayer, each Muslim is instructed to turn their face toward the forbidden place, the sacred gathering. Yet, despite the prohibitions, this place was not a formal building. It was an extensive territory, marked by special stones placed along the borders of the sacred area, within which even birds were forbidden from flying or engaging in any activity. To define such a boundary, special stones were required, impressive and possessing unique features that would serve as markers. Ordinary small round stones could easily be lost among the sand and small desert rocks. That is why, to mark the boundaries of the sacred territory, substantial massive stones with distinctive traits were necessary to fully emphasize its holiness. In modern-day Mecca, such granite or large stone boundary markers are no longer visible. Possibly they were destroyed or lost over time. It is also likely that originally such stones never existed or were located elsewhere. If Petra initially represented an ancient holy city of Islam, then similar boundaries and special stones would undoubtedly be found there, not in Mecca. A number of interesting features can be continued. For example, the location of the so-called Jinn rocks, which in Russian means Jinn stones. This captivating constellation of square stone structures are whimsical and mysterious elevations that impress even the most discerning tourists. The local Bedouins gave them this unusual name, highlighting their mystical and magical nature. Overall, these abandoned yet majestic stone-formed ensembles create a unique atmosphere of ancient mystery and the distinctiveness of this place. On the territory of ancient and enigmatic Petra, there are more than 20 large ancient stone blocks, each playing a role in the system of markers situated around the city that indicate entrances to this mysterious site. These monuments seemingly served as reliable landmarks for travelers and pilgrims, and perhaps symbolized sacred and forbidden territories, as they are absent in the city of Mecca, which is the most important center of the Islamic world. If we assume that these stone beacons indeed marked a sacred boundary, it is quite plausible that such significant objects as the Masjid al-Haram or the Forbidden Sanctuary intended for worship and storing religious relics were located at this place. Moreover, if the Kaaba, the sacred and mysterious structure situated in Mecca, had been in this area, it would certainly be present here. However, it is not there, and the reason seems to lie in the powerful interventions of a man named Ibn Zubayr, who, according to legends, moved the center of the sacred relics so far away that it lost contact with the original location. Our study also examined the initial direction towards which Muslims oriented their prayers. Analyzing the architectural remains and the layout of the earliest mosques built within the first 100 years after the founding of Islam shows that all of them pointed precisely to Petra. Research by the expert on ancient mosques, Dean Gibson, allowed us to determine approximate timeframes when the direction of prayer might have shifted and when the orientation of the first cult structures changed. Can we attribute these significant changes to political events and intra-Islamic history of that era? Turning to historical chronicles, at that time, the Second Islamic Civil War broke out. During its peak, the governor of the Holy City, Mecca, was a man named Abdallah ibn Zubayr. He harbored particular bitterness and dissatisfaction, believing that this city was the most important in the Islamic world, its heart and the mother of all Muslims. However, the pragmatic authorities, seeking to strengthen their position, began to reorient their strategic plans, making Damascus the new capital, a center of power and strength. Such a move caused deep discontent among Zubayr and his supporters, as they saw Mecca as a sacred center that could not be regarded with casual prejudice. At that time, society was experiencing an intensification of corruption, and politics and internal conflicts in Damascus only worsened the situation. In the year 683 CE of our civilization, approximately 6 decades after the emergence of Islam, Ibn Zubayr proclaimed himself caliph in this sacred city, which marked the beginning of a new bloody war, the Second Islamic Civil War. The Umayyads, the ruling dynasty, mounted a strong opposition, sending military troops against Zubayr and his supporters. At that moment, Ibn Zubayr committed one of his most shocking acts. He destroyed the Kaaba, the oldest sanctuary of Islam, considered the holiest object. This unique architectural and spiritual shrine was literally eradicated. Its foundation was razed to the ground, and the precious black stone was taken out and placed nearby on a wooden stand decorated with fine silk ribbons. In response, the Umayyad forces continued fighting, striving to regain authority and defend their territory. 40 days after the destruction, unexpectedly for many, news arrived of the death of the reigning caliph in Damascus. At that time, His family arrived on the battlefield, and high military commanders began insisting on ending the military campaign, emphasizing the urgent need to return to Damascus to organize new elections and appoint a new ruler. The ruling Umayyad family and their close associates arrived at the site of the battle, demanding to return under the protection of the troops to facilitate a transfer of power. However, all these decisions were complicated by complex dating, which must be carefully considered, as chronicles from the Islamic era clearly indicate that after the death of the caliph, his 13-year-old son took his place. The authoritative source for this particular detail is the 20th volume of al-Tabari's historical works. This young heir survived only 40 days after his father's death, and his life ended tragically. He also fell victim to violence and brutal conflicts. Meanwhile, troops arriving from the Holy City began a slow but steady return to Damascus. Since the route from Mecca to the Syrian capital passes through harsh deserts approximately 400 kilometers long. If these troops traveled at an average speed of 20 miles per day, the journey would take about 43 days. Considering the time needed for message delivery and decision-making about the return, plus the 40-day march, it becomes clear that there simply wouldn't have been enough time for such events. Based on these calculations, making Mecca a plausible place to report such events would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible. If a different city, such as Petra, had been considered sacred, then the distance between it and other significant historical centers would have been considerably shorter. This issue, concerning the remoteness of sacred sites, has repeatedly been raised throughout Islamic history and has sparked many debates and reflections. In particular, Mecca, located in Saudi Arabia, is situated at such a considerable distance that many early stories and traditions from the dawn of Islam are difficult to realize in terms of transportation and movement. Periods of calm and the absence of active combat only allow speculation about what truly transpired during this pivotal era. The times of war gave Ibn Zubayr the opportunity to focus on strengthening his defensive lines and preparing for a possible future counterattack by the Umayyad forces. Now, I would like to introduce you to several volumes of Islamic history created by the renowned scholar and historian Al-Sabri. This author compiled a wealth of material, carefully describing key events that took place each year in the history of Islamic culture. He paid particular attention to each significant date and event, often creating entire chapters, sometimes two, to detail the circumstances. However, his works contain something remarkable and even mysterious. The battle for the Holy City lasted many years, which is not surprising, as the struggle over the city's fate was not only prolonged, but also exhausting. The 7th decade of Islamic history is especially significant, marked by major events that influence the course of all subsequent developments. Interestingly, Al-Sabri dedicates exactly 15 pages to describing the events of the 69th year, and then an entire 27 pages to the 71st year. But what occurs in the 7th decade? Why does he mention this period so briefly? Just a few lines? Perhaps the author faced a shortage of sources, or later editors decided to minimize the description of this time, excluding it entirely from their works. Nevertheless, even these few lines are an invaluable source of knowledge about what happened during those years and who participated in those events. From his notes, it is evident that Musa ibn Zubayr, most likely the brother of Abdallah ibn Zubayr, brought a significant supply to the Holy City. Interestingly, these supplies were not military equipment or weapons, but rather resources for sustaining the population and livestock. The records mention that he brought many horses and camels, indicating preparations for a possible prolonged siege or relocation. It is presumed that in that year, Ibn Zubayr's followers traveled south from Petra into the Arabian desert in search of a safer and more secure place to continue resisting the Umayyad forces. Unfortunately, specific details of this period were lost in al-Tabri's works, depriving us of exact information. However, it is known that a considerable portion of the supplies, including horses and camels, were intended to facilitate the migration of numerous people from the city to new lands. The lull in military actions continued into the following year. Ibn Zubayr, taking advantage of this temporary pause, decided to undertake a religious project, the reconstruction of the sacred Kaaba. However, al-Tabri does not provide specific details about the location of its new construction, nor does he clarify whether the reconstruction took place in Petra or in some other, safer area, the holy city of Mecca, which remains the center of Islamic faith. There is a suggestion that the new Kaaba could have been built in Saudi Arabia, and that the sacred black stone was transported there precisely for preservation. Such a step would have allowed, even in the event of losing the holy city, to preserve symbols of faith and objects with special sacred significance. Ibn Zubayr thereby would have strengthened his position, even if he lost control of the city after a defeat, since the stone and the new Kaaba would remain safe. When the new authorities and the new caliph solidified their positions, the Umayyad army, having lost Petra, returned to the territory of Islam. This time, their forces were significantly more powerful and numerous, armed with modern military equipment, among which siege engines, catapults capable of destroying walls and fortifications, played a prominent role. These events marked the beginning of a new conflict known among historians as the Mandi-Nikan War. Lasting just over 6 months and 17 nights, it was fought around Mecca and became a serious test for both sides. Yasufi bin Mahak, a prominent witness of these events, recounted how he observed the operation of massive siege engines tearing through the air with thunder and flashing lightning. The sky roared, lightning dispelled the darkness, and the battle raged amid rolling thunder and the clatter of stones, making the fighting particularly noisy and frightening. During the height of the battle, Ibn Zubayr took refuge in the ruins located near the main mosque, the Kaaba, striving to save his life and continue the resistance despite everything. This led to the start of another bloody struggle that ultimately destroyed the sacred area of the Kaaba, the city holding special spiritual significance for Muslims. During this war, Ibn Zubayr was defeated. However, his resistance persisted thanks to the faithful remaining in Medina, located within present-day Saudi Arabia. In the same historical period, when the state of Kufa was situated in Iraq and was a major center of the Islamic world, a sharp controversy arose regarding the direction in which Muslims should face during prayer. They faced a dilemma: to obey the old tradition and pray toward the stone of Petra, or to follow the new directives and face the holy city of Mecca. As a result, this fractured situation led to the powerful Islamic Empire, shaken by internal division, splitting into 2 parts. Initially, power in Syria, in the city of Damascus, belonged to the Umayyad dynasty, and their followers directed their prayers toward Petra. However, after a defeat in battle and a weakening of their influence, the eastern part of the empire came under the control of the Abbasids, who introduced their own changes into Muslim internal life. In particular, from this time onward, all prayer mosques built in those regions were oriented so that their walls faced Mecca. Observing this, one can notice how the tradition of constructing sacred buildings changed. Previously, each new mosque was designed so that its main entrance and internal orientation pointed toward Petra, that is, toward the holy city, Mecca. But later, some mosques built in Saudi Arabia were first projected to have their faces turned toward Mecca. However, a significant problem arose: what to do with existing mosques that were originally constructed with their walls oriented toward Petra? In response, during the reign of Caliph Uthman, special markers indicating the direction of prayer began to appear on mosque walls. It is said that, by the caliph's order, the first such signs were installed in the Mosque of Medina to make it easier for pilgrims to determine the correct direction to face during prayer. This fact seems very interesting because, until that time, mosques were designed so that believers would simply turn toward the walls of the Qibla and face the holy city of Mecca. Why then was it necessary to introduce special markings on the walls if the prayer direction had not changed? Time passed, and approximately 89 years after the founding of Islam, a new means of indicating the direction was introduced: a niche designed to specify the side toward which one should turn for prayer. Interestingly, this niche was added to both old and new prayer buildings and subsequently became a standard feature of every mosque. Initially, these niches did not exist. They appeared only after the direction of the Qibla was changed during a period of civil unrest among different Muslim factions. At that time, when the city of Kufa, under the command of Maktu ibn Zubayd, seized certain regions, people began praying toward the new Qibla located in Saudi Arabia, despite their previous orientation toward Petra. Among those involved in this struggle was Ibn Abdallah al-Musli, better known as Praise Be to God, who in his speeches said, "Glory to Allah for testing us with trials and forgiving us." He also expressed the idea that we are people facing the same Qibla as you, which sounds quite strange and raises many questions. However, historians argue that these words indicated that Muslims in Kufa had their own Qibla, different from the old direction, and that this situation plays a crucial role in understanding the events of subsequent years. When Ibn Zubayr ultimately fell and it seemed that his struggle had ended in defeat, the city of Kufa gained special significance as the center for the formation of the new Abbasid dynasty. It was in this city that a powerful theological community emerged, along with the start of precise copying of the Quranic text, which contributed to the dissemination of Islamic literature and the strengthening of new ideals among Muslims. At that time, society was in an extremely complex and confusing situation. Muslims, faced with political and religious disagreements, found themselves divided both within their communities and regarding external circumstances, guided by the will of Allah Himself. During those years, numerous questions arose that had no clear answers. How should one act correctly? Follow Prophet Muhammad, who was the center of religious life for Muslims, or orient oneself towards the holy places associated with his name? Should prayer be faced towards Mecca as commanded? Or is it necessary to direct one's gaze towards the sacred sites located in Petra, Jordan, where an ancient and revered holy object is situated? Additional doubts concern the orientation of mosques, which directions they should point to in order to properly fulfill religious requirements. Studying the development route of the Muslim world, researcher and scholar Dan Gibson prepared special maps indicating all the historical mosques built since the emergence of Islam. These maps clearly showed that the vast majority of structures traditionally pointed specifically towards the city of Petra in Jordan, a place that many regarded as a spiritual center. But at the same time, many questions arose. What about those mosques built in later centuries? Were they also aligned towards Petra? Or did the chaos of the times in determining the correct direction give rise to new, unforeseen solutions? And here begins the most interesting part. During extensive research, I discovered that mosques built during the early Muslim era show much greater diversity in their orientation. This period, approximately 100 to 200 years after the founding of Islam, became a time of turmoil and uncertainty when the first Muslim communities faced numerous questions about correct practice and prayer directions. An example is the Umayyad Mosque, built in the south of modern-day Syria, in the ancient city of Bosra. Most importantly, its orientation did not directly point to Mecca, as canon requires, and at the same time was clearly not aligned towards Petra, which immediately raised many questions. 5 years later, when Muslims had established themselves in power in the region, they built something resembling a palace in the Syrian desert, known as Qasr al-Khair al-Gharbi. The site plan of this complex shows that the palace and a small mosque are positioned so that their structures occupy the corners of a single architectural ensemble, and the entire layout appears to be oriented toward a direction roughly between Petra and Mecca. It can be assumed that these parameters may indicate that the original builders attempted to unify the two most important directions for Muslims, avoiding a definitive choice between them. Not far away, approximately 100 kilometers north of ancient Palmyra, another palace, Qasr al-Hayya Ishaqi, was constructed. A thorough examination of the land plans of these palace complexes reveals that both the complexes and the nearby mosque were not directly oriented toward Mecca or Petra. Instead, their orientations pointed toward an area situated slightly aside from these cities, indicating a certain intention to avoid precise alignment with any of the key locations. This, in turn, suggests that at that time, possibly due to circumstances or religious motivations, the builders sought to avoid choosing one of the two traditional directions in favor of a more neutral or intermediate orientation. The map clearly shows that the Qibla direction pointed specifically to the space between Petra and Mecca, indicating a conscious decision to position mosques and palaces such that their orientation did not coincide exactly with either of the two sacred cities. This was not a coincidence or mistake, but rather a deliberate choice that required other explanations. Later, approximately 109 years after the advent of Islam, the first mosque was built in Bangora, in what is now Pakistan, which holds special significance in the history of religion. Like many similar structures of its time, this mosque was a relatively simple building with a single wall indicating the direction of the Qibla, without elaborate niches or other complex elements. Interestingly, this wall still precisely pointed toward Mecca, located in Saudi Arabia, making it arguably the first mosque clearly and unambiguously oriented toward the sacred city of Muslims. It is thanks to this structure that the development of the tradition can be traced, and importantly, it is the first known mosque explicitly indicating Mecca. There were likely other similar structures that no longer exist today, structures that, in their time, could have served as guides for Muslim believers, helping them determine the correct prayer direction. This mosque holds a special place in history because it dates back approximately 100 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. This circumstance, according to many Islamic historians, questions the established traditional notions about the timing of the earliest mosques designed for orientation toward Mecca. Essentially, it suggests that the practice of aligning toward the sacred city could have emerged much earlier than previously thought, and that the tradition of orientation might have a more complex and diverse historical background. Our further analysis focuses on the Amiyad Palace located within the citadel of Amman, the capital of Jordan. It was built approximately 122 years after the founding of Islam, making it a relatively recent structure in the context of religious history. I should remind you that at the same site there is a mosque, which was erected somewhat earlier and was aligned, as has been determined, precisely toward Peter. This fact vividly illustrates how different periods could involve entirely different orientations of sacred buildings, from alignment with Peter to later alignments associated with Mecca. All of this demonstrates that the history and geography of mosques, palaces, and other religious structures are closely linked to the ongoing search for religious identity and correct directions, which often changed over time depending on political, cultural, and religious circumstances. During the construction of this palace, its Qibla was oriented toward Mecca, indicating that the initial prayer direction was indeed aimed toward the sacred city. However, over time, and with the construction of other significant structures, the Qibla was repeatedly altered, and these changes were not random, but reflected deeper historical and religious processes. Such findings help us better understand how and when these shifts related to the determination of the prayer direction occurred. During the period when this palace was built, a significant shift in the orientation of the Qibla was recorded, indicating transformations within the religious practices of that era. At this historical moment, literary sources for the first time mention Mecca as the central point of the Islamic world and as a key element related to religious orientation. The next most significant mosque to mention was located approximately 32 kilometers south of Amman, Jordan, known as the Palace Mushata Mosque. It was built in 743 AD, making it one of the early important architectural monuments in Islamic history. The grand complex, known as the Umayyad Palace, represented a true palace structure with a mosque situated in its southern part. This entire architectural ensemble was oriented toward Petra, an ancient city site, which gave it particular religious and cultural significance. An interesting fact is that during the same period, the Islamic community began to divide into various sects. Significant transformations were taking place in their beliefs and practices. Traditionalists, who adhered to conservative views, built mosques oriented towards the city of Petra, considering it an important spiritual center, while reformers established mosques directed specifically toward Mecca, emphasizing this holy city's paramount importance for Islam. There were also those who did not join either of these groups and refused to specify a particular Qibla direction, indicating a rift within the religious and political community. Major changes in Islamic history are also associated with the events that occurred when the Umayyad rulers, based in Damascus, embraced Islam and strengthened their authority. In 754 CE, following the conquest of Kufa, the new Caliph al-Mansur planned to build a new capital in the east that would become the center of his rule. He chose Baghdad, located in present-day Iraq, considering it the most suitable site for establishing a new city. The construction project of the new city was executed vividly and effectively, markedly different from the chaotic and unregulated development typical of most Middle Eastern cities of that era. The architects developed a plan based primarily on a harmonious and precise circle. In this case, they initially used ashes to outline the project on the ground to accurately determine the boundaries of the future city. Baghdad was fully completed by around 767 CE and had a diameter of about 2 kilometers, making it a compact and well-planned center. It is noteworthy that the city's images lack a niche indicating the direction of prayer, which suggests that the orientation of mosques within the city was probably established later. In the early years, during the initial period, one of the city walls served as a reference point for the Qibla, the direction directly aimed at Mecca. Subsequently, all other mosques built by the rulers of that era also aligned to the same orientation. This indicates that the first Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad and his first 4 rightly guided caliphs, prayed facing Mecca. On the other hand, the Umayyad rulers who governed Islam from Damascus traditionally oriented mosques toward the city of Petra, which over time could have led to the development of a specific practice. However, at the end of the Umayyad rule, an important event occurred that necessitated a change in the direction of mosques. As a result, one group of the built religious structures began to face Petra, another toward Mecca, and a third adopted a neutral position without indicating any specific direction. These disagreements led to a significant split within the Islamic world, especially in the West, where adherents of early traditions and old orientations remained. This split was also reflected in the geographical division. The Islamic world was divided into 2 major parts: the Eastern, under the influence of the Abbasid successors from Iraq, and the Western, controlled by the Umayyad rulers, who governed regions of North Africa and Spain. This historical stage was particularly important because the Umayyad rulers in Spain actively developed culture, creating architectural masterpieces that reflected the cultural and artistic flourishing of that era, leaving a significant mark in the history of world architecture. Spanish builders faced a quite complex problem that required a special approach to orienting mosques. Traditionally, Muslims prayed towards Petra, an ancient city that held sacred significance for them and served as a reference point for the direction of prayer. However, over time, and under the influence of new religious and cultural conditions, it became necessary to change the usual orientations. As a result, old traditions were somewhat broken, and new mosques no longer oriented towards that city. At the same time, their rivals, some members of the Abbasid dynasty, maintained the habit of praying towards Mecca, located in Saudi Arabia, and consistently sought to adhere to this direction. On the surface, this seemed like a simple solution, but for those constructing new mosques in Spain, it was evident that choosing between Petra and Mecca was not as straightforward as it appeared. Not everyone wished to follow the old traditions, and even among those who tried to orient themselves toward these two cities, unusual solutions emerged. Some craftsmen and builders in the Middle East decided to set the Qibla for their mosques in such a way that it pointed not directly to one of these sacred cities, but instead occupied an intermediate position between Petra and Mecca. As a result, unexpected evidence has been preserved in maps and archaeological finds. Mosques in North Africa and Spain were built so that their qiblas seemingly pointed somewhere in the southern part of the African continent, far from their actual orientations. At the same time, closer examination reveals that many of these mosques in North Africa and Spain are not strictly oriented towards Petra or Mecca, but rather parallel to the line connecting these two historically sacred cities. In other words, their qiblas, instead of precisely indicating one of the two locations, were directed parallel to the line drawn between Petra and Mecca, creating a sense of some confusion, a puzzle that modern researchers are still trying to decipher. When examining specific maps, it becomes clear that the mosques built in North Africa and Spain have their qiblas aligned parallel to the line connecting Petra and Mecca, and this is far from being a coincidence. This approach to orientation could have meant not only practical reasons related to the accuracy of direction determination, but also symbolic ones. In this way, the builders may have wanted to express their connection to both holy sites, uniting them along a symbolic line and creating something greater than just a technical aspect of orientation. Let's turn to yet another example that helps to understand this complex picture. At the same time as we discuss the Second Islamic Civil War, it is worth recalling that Ibn Zubayr, one of the key figures advocating for the independence of the Holy City, attacked there, in the city of Petra, which is sacred to Muslims. For 4 months, the Syrian army of Miyada besieged him, preventing him from leaving or strengthening his positions. Then, in October, these forces decided it was time to employ a tactic that initially seemed impossible. They assumed they could build a catapult directly against the city walls and use it not for destroying residential houses, as is commonly done in battles, but to attack the sacred sites within the city. This idea seems astonishing, since holy communal sites and valuable structures, especially revered by Muslims, are not normally subjected to conventional military actions like residential buildings. However, documents and accounts indicate that in this situation, the catapult was aimed directly at the city center, at its sanctuaries, which at first glance seems nearly impossible. How did this happen? The key lies in the unique geography of Petra. The city walls stretch to the north and south, crossing a picturesque valley surrounded by mountains. But on the northern side, the walls did not reach the canyon itself, as there was a waterway, the narrow permanent riverbed along which numerous ancient structures and fortifications are located. Accordingly, it is believed that the Syrians moved their catapult along this dry riverbed to approach the city stealthily and possibly deliver a surprise attack. These theories are supported by archaeological excavations. Architectural expeditions conducted by scientists from Brown University uncovered numerous pieces of evidence indicating that Petra was equipped with defense systems that were very effective in their time. During the excavations, Dr. Dan, a leading expert, discovered that one of the main ancient structures, the so-called Great Temple, had a system of defensive constructions that provided its fortification and protection from attacks. These structural elements are particularly visible at the doorways and walls, where traces of fortifications made of stone and special mortar are evident, allowing the walls to be strengthened. Their construction dates to the period after the devastating earthquake that occurred in the 15th year of the Common Chronology, indicating that defensive measures in Petra were undertaken precisely during the Restoration era. Interestingly, these defensive elements date back to approximately the 1st century AD, and no traces of battles or sieges in this area during that period have been recorded. Moreover, historical sources indicate that the main events related to the emergence and development of the city occurred during the rise of Islam, and archaeologists have uncovered numerous artifacts confirming the active life of this place at that time. To date, more than 400 different items have been found, varied in shape and purpose, evidencing the rich and vibrant history of the city. These artifacts, stone and ceramic objects, jewelry, parts of ancient weapons and tools, allow researchers to reconstruct the everyday life, culture, and military activities of the ancient inhabitants of Petra, as well as to understand how its role changed over the centuries. The entire collection of finds testifies not only to Petra's significance as a strategic and religious center, but also to its continued importance in regional events during the early Islamic period. Stones hidden at the right time and in the right places serve as compelling evidence that battles indeed took place in this area, and they also confirm that the original Kaaba was located nearby. The presence of these stones, thrown as proof of conflict, became one of the reasons for the division within Islam into two primary factions: the traditionalists and the reformers. Traditionalists continued to pray facing Petra, which is in Jordan, pointing to the historical center associated with the original faith. Meanwhile, reformers turned their prayers toward Mecca, now located within present-day Saudi Arabia. Each side consciously chose its own path, seeking to find answers to a complex spiritual dilemma, and both aimed to express their faith in the most worthy way. The city of Petra, also widely known as the City of Weeping, endured a series of devastating cataclysms that completely altered its appearance and destiny. Powerful earthquakes ravaged the region, destroying buildings, temples, and homes, and leaving behind the shattered remains of what was once a magnificent city. The damage was so extensive that Petra could only be partially restored, and its original glory could never be fully regained. As a result, the crystal-clear evidence of the original Kaaba disappeared, since most of its remains were destroyed. Catapults and siege weapons used in combat destroyed the main parts of the sacred structure, and historical figures such as Ibn Zubayr, with his dragon, stormed and dismantled its remaining sections. He demolished the remnants in Simbaseo in the 13th year of the Islamic calendar. At the same time, the strongest earthquakes damaged the dam that diverted water around Petra, amplifying the destruction even further. Every year, the flow of receding waters eroded all traces remaining from the ancient monument. As a result, roughly half a century after the beginning of the Islamic era, mentions of Peter started to disappear from the historical scene, and information about him gradually faded from memory. Over time, both of these sacred sites, those of Peter and Mecca, began to be perceived as a single spiritual realm. It is especially significant that, as the Muslim religion developed, all prayer practices were directed specifically toward Mecca, which is now located within modern Saudi Arabia. Only with the advent of modern archaeological technologies, satellite imagery, and accessible information resources were specialists from around the world able to join forces to study the mysterious history of this region. and only thanks to these advances did it become possible to understand how past events influenced the formation and development of Islamic civilization. To complete the picture, it is important to consider several key aspects, as they played a decisive role in shaping the historical context. First and foremost, the era of early Islam must be noted, a period during which there was a significant shortage of literature created by devout Muslims who actively destroyed any manuscripts, books, and written monuments that did not relate to the Quran. These threats concerned not only texts that were part of the historical heritage, but also inscriptions, libraries, and manuscripts, almost everything that could recall a broader cultural space. Essentially, people had to rely solely on memorized revelations given to the Prophet Muhammad, which gradually became the foundation of Islamic faith. Evidence from this period is well documented. One of the most notable pieces is a letter dated to the 40th year of the Islamic era, sent by Caliph Omar, leader of the Muslim forces in Egypt, to a general named Amr. In this letter, he inquired about the fate of thousands of manuscripts found in storage facilities in Alexandria. The caliph's response was recorded and has survived through the centuries. It clearly stated that if the contents of these books matched Allah's revelations, they should be preserved. If they contained anything else, they ought to be destroyed entirely. Regarding other books, particularly those obtained from searches and discoveries of that time, my opinion is the following. If their content confirms the truth and aligns with God's revelations, they can be kept. Otherwise, they should be destroyed, since truth alone should remain the sole foundation of Muslim faith. There is a historical document that describes how books were used in Alexandria. Ibn al-Kifti, a Muslim scholar and writer, noted that these manuscripts were used to keep public baths warm. He mentioned that burning them took approximately 6 months, so numerous were these materials. Patriarch Eutychius, head of the Church of Constantinople, recorded in his notes that hundreds of bats had access to the books from the destroyed library of Alexandria for 400 years. Let's start with the fact that the emergence of the practice of burning books did not occur in Egypt, as many might think, but much earlier, in Persia, approximately 4 years ago. It was there, in those distant times, that the troops of Caliph Omar confronted the armies of the Persian Empire in the bloody Battle of Qadisiyah, which took place in 630 AD. In the early days of January of the following year, that is 637, the Muslim vanguard reached the outer borders of the Typhon fortress and, weakened, nevertheless began the siege of the city. These 2 months of heavy fighting ended with its capture. Typhon was taken, and the palaces and the library located in Ctesiphon were deliberately destroyed and burned. During these destructive events, only one sacred book survived, the famous Quran, whose origins are rooted deep in history. It alone outlived those years and became the only written memory of what had been orally transmitted from generation to generation. For a long time, historians have been fervently debating the origins of the Quran. There is a version that its main part was transmitted orally and not recorded on paper. This is explained by the fact that the Arab people were renowned for their incredible memory and ability to retain entire texts in their minds, including sacred sayings. However, oral transmission of any important knowledge is not without difficulties. First, participants in this transfer had to be absolutely sure that they reproduced what they heard exactly and without error. Otherwise, disagreements could arise about how to transmit certain verses and whether they should be included in the final sacred text. Second, the transmission of knowledge from more experienced to less experienced individuals often encountered obstacles. Most commonly, those who memorized the words of Prophet Muhammad were warriors, which was quite natural for those times. But it was precisely these warriors, engaged in battles, who often perished, taking with them not only their lives, but also part of the memory of the Quran. This fact was most vividly demonstrated in the Battle of Uhud, where, according to one estimate, about 450 men who knew the Quran by heart were killed. One day, one of the notable companions, Uthman ibn Affan, made an important decision concerning the preservation of the sacred text. A man named Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman came to him. At that time, the people of Damascus and the inhabitants of Iraq were engulfed in war. They sought to subjugate regions such as Armenia and Azerbaijan. Hudayfa felt anxious because serious disagreements existed in these cities over the understanding and interpretation of the Quran. He addressed Uthman with a request to safeguard the unity of faith and doctrine, to prevent splits and disagreements that could ultimately undermine the foundations of the Muslim community. Uthman immediately sent a message to his friend, Hausa, a woman who knew many details about the sacred book, and asked her to send the Quran manuscripts. The goal was to gather the most accurate copies of the text to preserve its authenticity and perfection. Hausa quickly sent the necessary material, after which a group of men with the required knowledge began creating new copies of the Holy Scripture. Uthman approached 3 respected Quraysh, members of an ancient tribe, and asked them to write the text in their dialect, since the Quran was revealed specifically in that language. After completing the work, several copies were produced, some of which proved to be more successful and accurate than others. As a result, Uthman returned the original manuscripts to Hausa and ordered copies to be distributed across different regions of the vast Muslim empire. He also issued a decree that all oral and written materials related to the Quranic texts were to be destroyed to prevent possible errors and disagreements. First of all remaining fragments of manuscripts, complete copies, and any other materials associated with the Quranic texts were burned. This act became an integral part of efforts to standardize the holy book. However, despite these measures, disputes over the accuracy and content of the Quran continued. When new, more accurate copies began arriving in various parts of the Islamic world, fierce debates ensued, during which each tried to prove the correctness of their version. For example, one well-known companion, Sa'id bin Habis, stated, "When we were copying the Quran, we omitted one verse from Surah Al-Kahzab. I remember hearing the Messenger of Allah recite it, and I searched for it together with Husaym bin Tabil. These 5 or 6 copies remained intact, the only ones preserved throughout Uthman's empire." This fact clearly demonstrates the difficulties and importance of carefully preserving the sacred text in those historical conditions, where every step relating to it could have enormous consequences for the unity of faith and Muslim identity. To completely destroy any remaining documents related to the Quranic materials, authorities took radical measures. They set out to eliminate all existing copies of the Quran, except for a few kept by provincial leaders. All books and written sources unrelated to Islam were fully destroyed, and afterward, Muslims also got rid of most of their manuscripts and sacred texts. As a result, only about 5 or 6 copies of the Quran are estimated to have survived. At that time, the territory of the Islamic Empire covered a vast area, from the Atlantic Ocean in the west through the Middle East to Afghanistan in the east, and within this broad region, very few handwritten copies of the sacred text existed. Thus, in terms of quantifiable units, it was a true literary vacuum. The diversity of original and rare manuscript copies had almost disappeared. Later, when the Abbasid dynasty came to power, they recognized this critical deficiency in preserving historical and religious knowledge and began to take measures to address it. However, they faced a challenge. They were forced to create their own version of Islamic history that aligned with their political agenda. As a result, all materials collected and maintained under their control became politically correct interpretations of Islamic history. These historical sources, as well as hadiths covering more than 250 years, were copied, disseminated, and used for educational, religious, and administrative purposes. At the same time, Works written earlier were either completely destroyed or subject to editing and rewriting by later authors, who believed it was necessary to adapt them to the new political reality. During the Abbasid Caliph's reign, significant discrepancies and contradictions in existing historical sources emerged, highlighting the need for their updating and unification. The Abbasids launched large-scale projects related to religion, science, and education, which not only celebrated the early stages of Islam, but also served to legitimize their authority and right to govern the empire. Within these transformations, historians created special treatises on the history of Islam and revised existing accounts, correcting and supplementing them. For instance, we have hardly any original biography of the Prophet Muhammad. Instead, Ibn Hisham, acting under the guidance and approval of Abbasid authority, introduced his corrections and additions to the story, aiming to fix what they considered to be serious errors in the initial account. Following this historian's work, other well-known Islamic scholars appeared, writing their own versions of historical accounts, often reflecting the new religious and political perspectives that prevailed at the time. As a result, the historical portrayal of Islam gradually began to be shaped in accordance with state ideals. An inevitable question arises: could Muslims have fallen under the influence of hidden or overt manipulations by those in power? Perhaps some intentionally destroyed or concealed parts of knowledge to distance believers from authentic prayer practices and doctrine. According to the laws of the Quran, Muslims were supposed to pray in Mecca at the sacred Black Stone. Yet there are reports that authorities directed them to forbidden sites, such as Petra, or their own special places of worship. What interests me more deeply is whether Muslims in the early period could have been misled by the propaganda activities of the Abbasids. Perhaps initially their leaders gathered fragmented portions of the holy text, but later, to strengthen their authority, they sought to destroy or edit parts that could contradict their version of history. This practice highlights a significant gap between Western traditions of historical criticism and the Muslim approach to sources. Western scholars generally consider later manuscripts less reliable, as these works are nothing more than copies of earlier texts that often lost their authenticity over time. Therefore, to obtain more accurate information, one must refer to original manuscripts, which are more valuable, harder to forge, and more closely reflect the original source. At the same time, Muslim scholars believe that earlier textual sources are not always trustworthy, as they could contain erroneous information or have been heavily revised or replaced by later versions that, in their view, better convey the true meaning and need to align with current religious and political perspectives. Even within the most sacred text of Islam, the Quran, there exists a position that raises many questions and debates. Some evidence suggests that later revelations allegedly annul or replace earlier ones. If one accepts this possibility, and the concepts of abrogation are permitted in Islamic history and theology, this opens the door to numerous discussions regarding changes and interpretations of the Holy Scripture. If the claim that the Arab Abbasids forged parts of the Quran is true, it would represent a major upheaval in the understanding of Islamic faith and its history. Imagine how such assumptions would impact the Muslim world, how they would influence the authority of the Holy Book and trust in its texts. Were some of them altered or artificially corrected? For example, how and in what way did the name Mecca remain in the Quran, especially in Surah As-Saf, where it is mentioned with particular reverence? It is known that the first canonical compilation of Quranic texts was made by Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, who carefully collected the historical revelations. Later, Uthman, his successor, used this collection as a basis, expanding and supplementing the canonical texts. However, historians point out that even after the final version of the Quran was established during Uthman's era, a large number of ayat, the verses, remained in the memories of Muslims, which many believe Muhammad himself recited or pronounced, and that their content was not included in the official recension. With each new edition, the Quran allegedly became more complete and finalized, and its propagation emphasized its fullness and uniqueness. Later versions claim to contain the most important, all revelations, including those that previously were not part of the canon. Some sources suggested that the more complete Quran, prepared by the Basids, also included references to the holy city of Mecca, which should hold a special place in Islamic tradition. Today, numerous handwritten copies of the Quran, created in Kufic script from the ancient city of Kufa, are preserved in museums around the world, from Istanbul to Samarkand. This script is what makes these historic manuscripts highly renowned. But what about Quranic texts created earlier than the appearance of Kufic script? It is not surprising that in ancient monuments written before the advent of Kufic script, there are no lines or verses concerning changes to the Qibla, or specifically about the city of Mecca. This raises concerns and hypotheses that early texts may have lacked such information or perceived it differently. Some scholars and researchers accuse me of attempting to rewrite the history of Islam. However, I want to make it clear. My intentions are not related to falsification or alteration of facts. I am merely proposing to consider one hypothesis, which does not contradict the main tradition: the possibility of minor changes in interpretation or even in the texts themselves. Long ago, in ancient times, the sacred city of Islam was called Becca. I believe that this is what it was called in those times when events unfolded in the period following destructions and earthquakes that devastated the region. After these cataclysms, in my view, the city of Petra, known as the Holy Mountain, began to play a special role. It was there, according to tradition, that Ibn Zubayr moved the Black Stone, a sacred relic, to Mecca. In such a situation, only minimal and nearly imperceptible changes to the Arabic script would be needed to transform the name of this ancient city, replacing the letter B with M. And that's all. Such a small modification could go unnoticed by later readers and scribes, especially considering that, at the time, calligraphers and scribes existed who might not have noticed or given importance to such subtlety. It is possible that later copyists, especially during the Abbasid period, corrected or edited old references to the ancient city of Becca, gradually transforming them into references to Tumek, as it is known in Islamic tradition. It is also plausible that all evidence points to Petra being the very ancient Becca, where Islam, its beliefs, traditions, and religious rites originated. Many mosques built over different centuries within the Islamic world clearly indicate a sacred place identified by historians and archaeologists as Petra. Descriptions fitting this city are found both in Quranic texts and in hadiths, as well as in Islamic tradition as a whole. According to the prescriptions, Muslims are instructed to face the sacred place of gathering during prayer, and the texts of the Holy Scripture do not mention the Black Stone as a key element of the hadith concerning the Qibla. Although Dan Gibson's research, one of the most renowned scholars in the field of Islamic history, is profound and rooted in the study of the historical origins of religion, his theories have sparked considerable controversy among Muslims. In an era when more and more research is being conducted to scrutinize the fundamental claims about the origins and development of religions, it becomes necessary to acknowledge that many dogmas and versions require a more serious analysis. The Islamic world, like other religious traditions, must consider whether more than 1 billion believers today have been misled regarding the history of their religion's inception, how the sacred texts were formalized, and how they evolved over time. Ultimately, one must ask oneself, what will be the outcome of these reflections for an ordinary Muslim living in the modern world? What consequences might arise from assumptions about potential distortions or edits in the Holy Book? And how crucial is it now to preserve sincere faith, relying not only on sacred texts but also on history, which may have held secrets hidden even up to our time.